focus and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist. Let's go.
You can hear me now, right? You should be able to hear me now. I was on the wrong thing. Okay, yeah, we live. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. I'm gonna start over. Okay, my bad, y'all. So we're talking about addiction. Can you hear me now on YouTube? Okay, good. Sorry. So really quick. So I'm gonna just quickly do this intro again. We're talking about addiction. A lot of times people don't understand that addiction is something that doesn't happen overnight. people look at addiction as something that only happens to people that are unhoused or living outside. They don't look at wanting to come home every night and have wine every night as leading to some addiction, right? There's so many different ways. And according to the CDC, what addiction is it refers to the use of selected substances, including alcohol, tobacco products, drug inhalants, and other substances that can be consumed, inhaled, injected, or otherwise absorbed into the body with possible dependence and detrimental effects. Today, I want to talk about like the root causes of addiction because of substance use, because a lot of times people are addicted and don't realize like why it's happening. Or I think the more we know, the more we can grow. I started coming on social media and creating an online presence because I worked in the ER, and I had a male who came in with a lot of like heart issues, which he was cleared medically. And after somebody's cleared medically, they call in the psych team. And after speaking to him, I came to realize he had been sober for a month. And what was happening, what I explained to him is his cause or the thing that led him to addiction was him trying to probably alleviate some of his anxiety symptoms. And that was really freeing to him. And I remember that story, and I remember thinking like a lot of people don't understand why they're using or how they're using. And so I decided like I came on this path to like talking about mental health. And that's how I got there. So we're just going to quickly go over the different reasons or ways people start to become addicted to substances. The first one is experimental. So the experimental drug stage is a social behavior. You'll find yourself associated with people who take drugs to unwind or for fun. Although you've had no cravings, you'll think of drugs often. At this stage, your body is miles away from developing dependence. So experimenting with substances is one of the ways that people begin to start with addiction. Maybe their life is fine. Maybe they're not trying to numb any pain, but they're around people that are constantly using. And so they start using, and then their system starts to develop a dependence, right? So that's one of the causes. A huge cause that happens for a lot of people is childhood trauma. So there is a clear link between childhood trauma and alcohol and drug addiction. Traumatic events in children experiences often follow them as they mature into adults, creating mental health issues that may cause them to use alcohol or drugs as a way of self-medicating. Anytime, when I think about substance abuse, I always think about like people trying to numb their pain. And for people that have gone through childhood trauma and it's going unchecked, you haven't really dealt with it. As you get older, life gets really challenging. You're triggered a lot depending on your trauma and what you were exposed to. And unfortunately, the reality is like using sometimes helps in that moment. Like that's just the fact. It does help in that moment. But the issue comes into play where you become dependent on it. And I always tell people, like, you can't just numb one part of you, right? You can't just say, like, I don't want to feel pain. I'm going to numb the pain. When you try to numb one part of you, you end up numbing the other part where you're not able to either experience joy. So childhood trauma. Another cause is genetics. So if you have a family history of addiction, it's especially important to make sure your child knows. As with other genetic disorders, the closer the family relationship, the greater the risk. Your child's genes may make it more difficult to stop using substances should they start. And a lot of times in families, we keep everything on the hush. We don't talk about like things until the shit hits the fan. And then all of a sudden, like we find out like this person struggled and that person struggled. Genetics are huge. A lot of times people won't even go near substances because they know that it runs in their family. Which means that they're more susceptible to developing a dependence than somebody else. So understanding your like family dynamic is important, and be open with talking about it so that you don't continue to allow that trajectory to keep going on in the history. I think the more people know, the more they could be more mindful of their usage. The next one is prescription drugs. Now, this was a huge one. So I started working in a shelter in 2000, right before right before 9/11. Yeah, 2000. Oh, today is 9/11. That's crazy. So I say that that's a reference point because I feel like there was a lot of money and a lot of resources for people before 9/11, and after 9/11 there was not. But a lot of people, I would do their intake, right? Prescription drugs were a huge cause of how people started to develop dependency on substances. They would have an injury, and a lot has changed since with all the lawsuits and stuff. They would have an injury, they would get prescribed like 90 meds at a time, 90 pills, a 3-month supply, and they're in pain. They're in literally physical pain, and so they start to continue to use it to stop the pain, but then they don't realize that their body started to develop a dependence on it. And I've watched different documentaries about some of these pharmaceutical companies and how they knew the risk, and that just bothers me that they knew the risk, but they went with the money piece. They didn't care about the person. And so there are a lot of people that are struggling with addictions because it started with some kind of injury or some kind of prescription that they were given and weren't really given knowledge about the effects that it can have on them. So prescription drug abuse is the use of prescription medicine in a way not intended by the prescriber. Prescription drug abuse, also called prescription drug misuse, includes everything from taking a friend's painkiller for your backache or snorting or injecting to get high. Another root cause of addiction is loneliness. So, if you experience trauma in your childhood, you may have trouble with emotional closeness, maintaining relationships, and feeling safe with others as an adult. Each of these factors can lead to deep feelings of loneliness. Loneliness is such a huge thing that happens, especially if you've had trauma growing up. It's really hard to get close to people. And it's not that people are bad, but all of your alert systems are going up when you're trying to develop new relationships, even if they're healthy, if the trauma hasn't been dealt with. And so a lot of times what people do to mitigate the loneliness is use. And again, at the beginning, it feels like it's fine. It doesn't feel like a big deal. But unfortunately, like the brain starts to develop an addiction to the usage if you're not mindful. Another cause is peer pressure. So peer pressure might make you feel obligated to take drugs to feel like you're part of a group, not labeled as being weak or boring. I will say I've seen a lot of literature change around drinking. I've been seeing people talk about mocktails more. I feel like for a long time, if you weren't drinking, it was like, oh, what's wrong with you? Or you're not cool enough or whatever. But I feel like now not drinking is starting to be more normalized. I think people are seeing the effects that it has on people, but peer pressure is definitely one of those things that are a root cause to addiction. Another thing is that it makes me feel good. So, chronic use of substances over time, the brain circuits adapt and become less sensitive to dopamine. Achieving that pleasurable sensation becomes increasingly important. But at the same time, you're building a tolerance and need more and more of that substance to generate the high level of craving that you start to develop. So, you use the substance, it feels good, you feel like you're on top of the world, you're able to do all these things, and then you continue to do that, then you need a little bit more, then you need a little bit more, right? So that it makes me feel good that you started off at a small dosage. If you continue on that track, that could continue to go up. And for some people it could be like anxiety, like let me drink a little bit, let me smoke a little bit so that I don't feel these things at all. And if some people are able to manage it in a healthy way, but so many people don't realize that, yeah, it makes me feel good. It's a quick fix, but also I need to do some self dialogue. I need to do some things to help. Substances alone will not completely um, take everything away, right? There's some work you have to do on your end. Even if you're taking prescription medication, there's still things you have to do. There's no way to completely like shut off one part of you. And I think people don't understand that. Now, the link between substance abuse and mental health. So mental health struggles are such a huge cause of substances, and it's something like your mental health is so important to understand, because when you don't, unfortunately, you're trying to like fix it by any means necessary. So there's a link between mental health and substance abuse. So self-medication, obviously, like you're struggling with some things, you don't know how to deal with it. Brain changes. So people don't realize this, but your brain in the way that it is operating can begin to change. Sometimes when people start becoming addicted at a young age, let's say 13, 14, 15, their like development stops at that time. You can have people that are in their 40s, 50s, and you'd be like, damn, they're still acting like a child, because of the fact that they've been using for so long. They never gave their brain a chance to develop. So that's something that can happen. Shared causes. So mental health and substance use disorders can share underlying causes such as genetic vulnerabilities, changes in brain. There's a such thing as substance-induced psychosis. So substances you use can cause psychosis, which can last for weeks, days, sometimes permanently too. Like that's so scary. Like sometimes there are people that may have used one time and they never went back to baseline. And sometimes some of the things that you're using, and nowadays, like people are putting different things in drugs, and so people unfortunately are passing away because of it, right? So it's so important to really think about your mental health. So all of the things that I talk about on here about how to take care of your mental health, and the things that you can do are important, because when you can work on managing it, you're not doing things to supplement. And today we're talking about substance abuse, but when I think about addictions, there's so many other things outside of substance use. There's food, there's shopping, there's relationships, there's work, right? There's so many other addictions. But today we're focusing on substance use and the harm that it can have. And I think sometimes deep down inside, people will know that like they're kind of using a little too much, but not really knowing like, well, what can I do to change, or how can I start the process? So the next two things I want to say before we go is helping somebody struggling with substance use, because sometimes it may not be you, the listener. It may be somebody in your family, a friend that you have. So I want you to think about that. The first thing is really making sure you're keeping yourself safe. Have a response plan if it escalates, restricting access to money, setting boundaries, encouraging treatment. Joining a support group and self care is important. If you have a loved one, a child, a partner, people that are close to you that are struggling with substances, it can take a toll on your mental health. And a lot of times, what I find is that people are doing more work than the person themselves. And it's hard to separate yourself from somebody that you love. But it's necessary, because if you're not okay, then how are you going to help them? Boundaries are huge, because if you're not setting boundaries, then you're kind of allowing that behavior to continue. So I know it's hard if you're somebody listening and you're like, I don't struggle with this, but I have like my child is struggling, or this person is struggling. I really want you to remember it's important to prioritize your need, your self-care. It's so important. And then support, like a support group. There's programs like Al-Anon, for people that have family members of somebody struggling with addiction that you can tap into. There may be other support groups, but don't do it alone, right? That's important to not fight this fight alone when it comes to that. And then if you are the person that's struggling, I want to give you some things to think about, right? So exploring your treatment options is important, right? There's so many different things. There's AA, there's treatment centers where you can actually go in and detox, support groups, some religious places, churches, or whatever you subscribe to may have some kind of support group. Being mindful of the different treatments that are available as you're navigating this, building your support network, because you can't do this alone, as much as you want to. I think making sure you're able to identify the emotion, because you may have a lot of shame or guilt. Don't let that emotion stop you from reaching out and building out your support network. That's so important. Learning healthy ways to cope with stress and being aware of your triggers. A lot of times you don't know, you have, all you know is like we party, drinking, smoking, like that's all you've been exposed to. Like for some people it's literally their lack of exposure to other opportunities to heal. And if you've only witnessed when things go wrong, somebody's lighting up or somebody's grabbing a bottle, if that's the only thing that you've seen and that's the only thing you're going to do. So you have to be mindful and expose yourself to other things when it comes to dealing with your stress. Because I understand that you may not have been taught, and it's not your fault that the way that you learned was through watching your caregiver like drink their problems away. But right now, like as an adult, and if you're finding yourself struggling, if you're drinking at night and you're struggling waking up in the morning, or your day, you're more irritable, don't get me wrong, at when you get that bottle or whatever and it takes things away for that moment, I get it. But think about the effects long term, right? Because now like you're not really sleeping well. Now you're waking up hungover. There's so many more there's so many more consequences to using than there is to not using. But the reality is in the moment it does feel okay. So really being honest with yourself and giving yourself what you need. And then changing your environment, changing your allow the support to help. Yes, that's a good point. And when I just said building your support team is important, but also making sure you're going to allow them to help, because if you don't, like, I get that you can be super independent, but if you don't allow them to help, you're going to be doing this by yourself. And changing your environment, I want to say, I understand that sometimes socioeconomic status does not allow you to get up and go to a new city, a new state, right? And sometimes your actual living space is hard. And so like let's step outside of that. Like I understand like you don't have control over that, but let's think about what you have control over. Start to guard your ears, paying attention to what you're listening to, what you're exposing your mind to. Sometimes this shift may not be able to physically happen. And I think we can get stuck in the barrier. And I think that's a huge barrier because it would be so nice to just go out of that space and go somewhere else. So I'm identifying that that is a real huge barrier, but I don't want you to get stuck in the barrier. I want you to think about, okay, I know I can't leave my physical space. I can't afford it. I don't have the means to do it. But what can I do? And you just really got to start to um, tap into other environments or other spaces, whether it's literally where you're networking or connecting with other people, or if it's online, you're joining some things online, you're listening to some things online, because you got to give your mind new information. As we're changing, we're the person that keeps us away from change, right? We're our biggest opposer, because what's happening is our system is so used to the addiction, is so used to doing things a certain way, that as you try to change, it's going to have a hard time with that change. And so you really have to be intentional on allowing your mind to see like, yeah, I know I've been probably drinking all my life and using this all my life, but we're going to give it a new narrative, right? You have the power to do that. And I know it can be really challenging. I always say if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. And it's not easy. So if you want to work on creating change in your life and you can't physically change your environment, try to work on mentally changing your mindset. And the more you can mentally try to change your mindset, the more you can try to come up with the plan to work on that physical environment change. So I say all that, as we're wrapping up, I want to say that nothing happens overnight. If you're somebody that struggles with substances and you relapse, have grace with yourself, right? If you're trying to work on changing that piece and giving yourself a new narrative about where you want to go. Start to visualize yourself not using. Start to visualize the places that you want to go in life. And when you're doing that and when you work on that, your mind will start to show you the possibilities. You got to give yourself a new narrative. Just because it's been a certain way your entire life doesn't mean it has to stay that way. If you're still breathing, I always tell people that there's room for change. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this makes sense. Don't forget, you can follow me everywhere at Celeste the Therapist. So you can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and my wellness center. If you go to www.stwyt.com, you can find information about that on there. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I will see you next Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Focus and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste the Therapist. Let's go.